Hello and welcome to Down to Earth with Terry Virts, where we talk about what matters down here on planet Earth. If you love the podcast, please subscribe and give us a rating. Today, I'm super excited to have David Braziel on. David is the CEO of RBN Energy, which produces an industry-leading daily energy blog, as well as providing consulting services about all aspects of the energy universe. David, thanks for joining us.
Terry, as always, thanks for having me on.
It's good to see you again. I don't know if you know my story. I actually, when I was coaching Little League, one of the dads on the Little League team is an oil and gas guy. And I said, hey, I'm really interested in energy. And, one of these days I'm going to be leaving NASA. And he said, oh, you got to subscribe to RBN. They got a great daily blog. That was probably 10 years ago or more. It was a long time ago.
Well, that's great to hear. You got to give me that guy's name and we'll pass him a commission.
Yeah, I don't think he needs a commission. He was running a pretty big oil and gas company. But he was right. It's such a cool blog that you guys do. Like every day there's some random article about West Texas Intermediate, Brent crude spread, or carbon capture projects, or, every day it's something different tied to rock and roll.
Yeah. Well, it's a little bit better than random. Kind of, as you mentioned at the outset, because we're doing this in conjunction with our consulting practice. I mean, it's which way the wind is blowing. When we hear a lot of people asking about the Permian, we're writing about the Permian, and like we were talking about just prior to hopping on, if everybody's asking about carbon capture or hydrogen, that's what we're writing about.
That's true. You're right. It's not random. It's actually every day. It's like, this is an interesting topic. If you're just interested in energy, or you don't, you're not an expert, or if you are in the industry, it's very relevant. And one of the things that I noticed from space, and I've told this story a lot of times, but basically during the daytime, you can't see people from space. You can, if you look, you can see London or Buenos Aires or whatever, but unless you're actually looking and know where you're looking, you don't notice people. And at nighttime, it's a very different story. And I was in space, I don't know, for a week or two, and it hit me that what I was seeing in these city lights at nighttime was not population, but it was wealth. And I had this profound realization that energy is what makes your life good, or lack of energy is what makes your life bad. And so it's such an important topic. It's gotten really horrendous press recently, especially by the left. But it is what makes your life, quality of life, what it is. And so it's super important for everybody on the planet, not just here in America.
Yeah. And I'm sure we're going to get into this, but I feel like that's a key that a lot of people miss in today's conversation. Everybody's looking to make the world a better place. And, we have rational people can disagree on how to make the world a better place. But I think that point you just said, that the availability of cheap energy, the ability for that to change people's quality of life for people who don't have, I guess we take it for granted here in the US, and from up in space, the US is, a fraction of what you're looking at most times during the day.
Yeah, absolutely.
All those other places that are dark at night, that, they could really use the benefit of cheap, affordable, reliable energy.
It's something so profound. And in the West, I always joke, hashtag first world problem. And when you hear, well, we need more wind and solar or whatever, I'm a big fan of preserving the planet, because one of the biggest things I saw from space was pollution in China, and also India to a lesser extent. But this is not scientific, this is just my own eyeball, but you could see a big brown smog over northeastern China. It was pretty ugly. So we don't want to do that. We want to improve the pollution situation, of course, and we want to mitigate climate change, of course. But we say that with kind of this, well, we'll still have the same amount of energy and we'll pay a little bit more, but not that much more. And that's another hashtag first world problem, because in the West, we can pay a little bit more and we're fine. In Central Africa, if you pay a little bit more, your kids die, right? Because they don't have refrigeration or whatever. So for wealthy nations, it's one thing. For poorer nations, it's a very different thing.
Well, and I'd say there's extremes on either side of that too. I mean, you look at the studies that have been done about people in third world nations who don't have access to natural gas or LPG, like in India, where they still have to burn biomass or
Yeah.
dung, I mean, that's a significant contributor to deaths over there. Whereas
Right.
over here, we're having the conversation of, how fast can we turn to electrification of the transportation fleet, right?
Right.
So how soon till we can all go out and buy that next Tesla? That's not the same conversation they're having in most of the world, where they want to get people on the roads and then they'll worry about electrification.
Well, they want roads. I mean, they're worried about how to cook dinner. Either don't cook it or have wood burning waste, or it's a luxury to have like an LNG stove,
Yeah.
In some parts. Well, so these are things I want to get to, but the first point I want to make is the thing that's everybody's talking about today. Everybody's talking about the price of gas, and oh my God, gas is $3, gas is $4. I was in LA a couple of weeks ago and it was over $6 there. It was crazy.
Right.
I love LA, but man, it's good to live in Texas sometimes. Why? And I actually did one of these podcasts last week. I did a little quick blurb about my thoughts on what's happening with the oil and gas, or the price of gas on the corner. And there's a lot of moving parts there. So I will let you explain, Professor Braziel, why does gas go up like it did?
I mean, anytime we're talking about commodity markets, whether it's natural gas, crude oil, gasoline, diesel, it's fundamentally supply and demand. And what happened was we were kind of tending to be long right up until COVID happened. And when the pandemic hit, we were suddenly long everything. Too much oil, too much gas, too much refined products.
What do you mean by long?
The supply was outweighed demand.
Okay.
So, that when supply outweighs demand, price suffers.
Price goes
so
down.
That's exactly. And that's what we saw. We saw prices for everything tank, all commodities tank, because nobody was really using nearly as much as they had been prior to the pandemic. And again, all of these trends had kind of started prior. If you remember, there was they don't like to call it, but somewhat of a price war between OPEC and Russia just prior to the pandemic, where they were pushing extra crude oil into the market, and it had already begun to lower prices, and then the pandemic hit, and all of a sudden prices just went to hell.
They went below zero for a day or for a few minutes, right?
Negative $37 and I think 63 cents on April 20th of 2020. That's true. That particular instance was more of a function of how the WTI contract is traded. So essentially, and I'll come back to the original topic, but just to finish out this one, the contract was coming up on the roll period for the prompt month. So that meant most of the financial contracts that are traded for WTI either had to be financially settled, otherwise they have to go to physical delivery. And what happened was some people got stuck holding barrels. They had to find somebody to offtake that contract for them, and the market smelled blood, and they couldn't unload those contracts for anything less than -7.
Paying them, so they had to pay people to take their contract. Because in commodities market, you don't ever actually take the oil; you just trade it. Somebody does eventually,
right?
But in this case, they got stuck holding the whatever.
They got stuck, and somebody had to put them out of their misery. But the point in saying all that is, was the true value of a barrel of crude oil -$37 that day? No,
right.
It wasn't. It was more of a quirk,
right.
an idiosyncrasy. Right. But the price was, $13 or something like that the next day. So it was still an incredibly low.
Crazy. It's crazy. Yeah. So for the last 5 years, oil's been really low. It's been brutal for oil, right?
So essentially since the 2014, 2015 price meltdown,
right.
Oil prices have been typically lower, but nothing like what we saw in the spring of 2020.
Okay.
And so when all that happened, the businesses involved in the energy value chain, they reacted accordingly, right? So the market was saying we have too much supply. So what did? They rationalized a lot of refinery capacity was rationalized and turned into things like renewable diesel. crude oil producers shelved their rigs, got rid of drilling crews, and said, we're gonna try and stick this out so that we're still around whenever crude oil prices come back. And everybody kind of did the same thing, right? The whole world hunkered down throughout COVID. And the big thing that's happening now is demand is back. You still have a lot of people telecommuting to work, and business travel through air is not nearly what it was prior to the pandemic. But for the most part, demand has recovered, and all those supply decisions that were made 2 years ago haven't yet caught up. So you have that now. The pendulum has swung the other way. Obviously, talking about commodity markets, the one thing you've also got to mention is OPEC, because they are the 800-pound gorilla in the room anytime you're talking about crude oil or products. They took a lot of product off the market when COVID destroyed prices, and they've been relatively disciplined in bringing that supply back online. Same with US producers. And so because we've had less supply and more demand, prices are just skyrocketing right now.
OPEC does not include Russia, right? OPEC plus is Russia, but OPEC is Saudi and Kuwait and Venezuela and other countries.
UAE, all those guys.
Yeah.
And it's mostly Saudi, Iraq, Iran. Those are a lot of the big boys.
Those are the big ones, yeah.
Yep.
So those guys want less produced because then the price goes up.
Well,
supply and demand, yeah.
Prior to this round, OPEC was notorious for setting crude oil production quotas and then breaking them, right? Mm-hmm. So everybody comes out and says, we're going to produce at level X. And this country in OPEC says, well, I'll produce a little bit beyond my quota. And, there wasn't very good discipline. It's really kind of shocked people how much discipline there has been in OPEC this time around.
Right.
And part of that is they're benefiting from the high prices. And part of that is that there's an open question for some of the smaller OPEC producers, whether they can actually meet their capacity targets anymore, as in they're producing as much as they can right now.
Right. They can increase it.
Yeah. And the Saudis can, but not all of them.
So over the last year, oil's been coming up. Is this because Biden canceled Keystone?
No. So Biden canceling Keystone it would have allowed more Canadian crude to flow cheaply to the US Gulf Coast.
Not only cheaply, but with less carbon footprint.
But remember, at the time that he came into office, that was our low demand period, right? Mm-hmm. So we didn't need additional pipeline capacity from Canada to the US Gulf Coast when he canceled it. We had plenty of pipeline capacity. It would have made things cheaper nowadays, especially since we are looking to replace, heavier barrels on the Gulf Coast that we might have gotten otherwise from Russia. So it would have been a nice to have, but it wasn't a necessity. I think the bigger deal was what it indicated to the country and to the investment sector about what the administration thought about oil and gas. Mm-hmm. So we've talked about this a lot, that you got to follow the money, right? So US producers, when everything hit the fan in 2020, they were hammered, right? Lots of them went out of business, lots of them got bought, there were lots of mergers and acquisitions. And when that happened, they changed the strategy that they've had for a long time. So not only did OPEC shift from, non-compliance to their quotas to this sudden, everybody got religion and everybody's complying to their quotas. The US upstream oil and gas producers, they have long cycle investment periods. And so prior to the meltdown, they had growth strategies where they would decide, based on their perception of what oil and gas prices would be, how much they would invest And they typically were trying to grow their production to increase their company's values. It didn't work out, especially didn't work out once there was no demand for additional growth. So they switched their strategies. They said, all right, we're going to keep our capital expenditures flat, and we're going to use any extra money to pay our shareholders. And it worked out great. So they paid down debt, they paid back their shareholders, and all of a sudden, US E&Ps look like great investments. The thing,
E&P, exploration and production, they're the guys that dig holes in the ground.
Right, exactly.
Looking for oil. Yeah.
Dig holes in the ground. I drill holes in the ground. How about that?
There you go. Drill. Yeah.
They do some digging up in Canada, I think. So when Biden cancels Keystone XL, it sends a signal to those E&Ps and to the people who invest in the E&Ps, that the administration they're looking to move away from oil and gas. And as an investor, I see that and I say, gosh, do I want to put my money into oil and gas long term when, we've had the Paris Agreement that says we're going to be quickly moving away from fossil fuels. That's backed up by the conferences in Glasgow, the COP26. Then, policy after policy coming out from the administration that says, hey, we're gonna increase the certification standards for pipelines. We're gonna pause leasing on federal lands. All these things that in and of themselves don't necessarily kill the oil and gas industry, but they do add a significant amount of risk to anybody who's looking to invest long term, because I mean, you can sit here and say, yeah, we're going to have EVs in 50 years, and so maybe Tesla looks like a great investment. But it's an open question. I mean, how long will oil and gas demand continue to be there if we keep doing everything we can to transition away? And I'm not saying that we shouldn't. I think a lot of people are very cognizant of the effect that carbon emissions have on the environment. But the question is, if we make decisions today that push us away from oil and gas, it's going to have a lot of really near-term effects. And I think we're kind of seeing the consequences of that right now in commodity prices.
Yeah. And besides, so I'm envisioning this Olympic race. It's a sprint race, and the oil and gas runner has a parachute behind their back, and the other guys have tailwinds. And another drag is not just from the government, but private sector money, equity and debt is not going to oil and gas. There's a big, I think, challenge if you're an energy company raising money. Man, there's a lot of companies that just won't lend to you, that won't invest in it. That's another kind of weird dynamic happening, I think. But back to the gas prices are going up at the pump. So the demand starts coming back after COVID. Supply is not going up, so the price goes up. The Keystone pipeline has very little to do with it. And then Russia invades Kuwait. So in other words, oil and gas was already coming up. And a big part of that, what you're saying, is that was just the post-COVID recovery.
Yeah. And so kind of tying all those factors together, it bears mentioning that crude oil is a global commodity, right?
Right.
So the price is going to be set on the global market, and US crude WTI is going to trade at a differential to the global benchmark, which is Brent crude oil.
So WTI is West Texas Intermediate.
Yep, West Texas Intermediate. So that's the US benchmark.
Right.
Clarification. So when we talk about the impact that global crude prices have on the price your dad is seeing at the gas pump at his neighborhood corner store,
right,
it's not quite as straightforward, I think, as a lot of people give it credit for. So US has a huge complex refining complex here, primarily located on the Gulf Coast of the United States. So we're able to take, you know, relatively local domestic supplies, run them through our refining complex, and sell the resulting refined products either domestically or on the international market. So that's really good for domestic refiners, right? So they get to benefit from U.S. prices for crude, which sell at a discount to the international market, and a market for their gasoline and diesel, which is again set on the international market. But we also have this big advantage in our complex refining system, and the fact that we have lower materials costs like natural gas, for example. So one of the things that we're seeing right now is natural gas, and we've kept it crude oil up to this point, but natural gas right now, I'm sure we'll talk about, is so expensive in Europe that it affects hydrogen production, and that hydrogen is used for desulfurization of the refined products. So they're having to shut down some of their hydro treating units, and that just gives U.S. refiners even more benefit over their European counterparts. So again, the price your dad is seeing at the corner store is reflective of, you know, these international prices, which are pushing all the way back into the U.S. market.
So it's not just when Russia is supplying, the supply goes down, right? The Russians aren't putting as much crude on the market. That's part of it. But there's other more complicated things in that the refiners have more trouble in Europe and so on. So there's other additives to that $4.39 or whatever it is you're saying.
Yeah.
So there's the crude oil that you pump out of the ground, and then there's the gasoline that comes out of the refinery. Gasoline and diesel and jet fuel and asphalt, and I'm not sure. There's a bunch of stuff that comes out of refineries. The gasoline is the most common thing. Whenever there's some global crisis, and I've noticed this is just me talking anecdotally, whenever something happens, the next day the price of gas has gone up 30 cents. And then when that thing calms down, it's down to 29 cents, and the next day 28 cents. In other words, it seems to take a lot longer to come back to normal than it does that shoots right up. Is that true, or is that just me seeing things?
No, I think that's true. I think there have even been studies on it. I don't pay too much attention to that, but it would make sense, right? Like,
yeah.
I do pay attention to the upstream, and I know that you've got to factor in risks, right? It's not just about what's going on today, but if you see tremendous volatility in a market like that, I'd rather err on the high side if I've got a business to run. Otherwise, you run the risk of selling yourself way short.
Right. It's been like Bitcoin recently, you know, just ridiculous things. Okay. So is it fair to say that the price of gas has gone up over the last year because the economy's recovered and every country on earth has been expanding demand without supply going up? So that's caused the price to go up. And then in the last month, it's obviously spiked because of the war, because A, Russia's producing less, and B, people just don't like uncertainty in wars, and price goes up when there's war. That's why it really spiked, and it really came down a couple of days later, right?
Yeah, it really came down and then really spiked again today.
Yeah. It did. I didn't know that. Yeah.
Well, and it's all about there was, you know, a little bit of indication that there might be some sort of ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine, and so prices started to come down a little bit, and then when it looked like it wasn't going to happen, prices went back up.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm not an expert on Russia by any means. For RBN, we typically focus on domestic markets, but I don't know if I could say that Russia is producing less. I know they are exporting far less to Europe and all the countries that have sanctioned them.
Right.
But whether or not that means producing less, or they have shifted those flows to other people who have not sanctioned them,
right,
I think that's an open question.
No, I think they're selling it to China, but you know, that's doing a deal with the devil. You know, I'm sure they're not getting $110 a barrel. China's probably getting it for a cheaper, I would guess. I don't know.
Which one's the devil in that scenario?
I don't know. There's no honor among thieves, I guess is what they say. But so I just to give people a thing, because it's really easy to turn on certain news channels and, oh my God, they canceled Keystone. If we should have American oil, well, there's so much more complicated issues behind things. And we had a discussion earlier about how sometimes the media wants to hear what they want to hear, and you tell them the truth and they'll go to someone else to get a quote. We just had that conversation. So I hope the listeners understand that there's a lot of complicated factors here. Canceling Keystone doesn't make sense to me. I think I'd rather, if we're going to use 1 million barrels of oil, I'd rather get that oil more cheaply and more environmentally efficiently than putting it on a train. But that in and of itself would have almost no impact on what we're paying at the pump. Vladimir Putin not attacking Ukraine would help a lot. So anyway, and LNG, or go ahead. Did you have something?
Only to mention that, Keystone, and so sucks that Keystone got canceled. Would have been a useful pipeline. There have been other projects to help get more Canadian crude down to the Gulf Coast. You talk about the Enbridge Line 3 expansion, Capline reversal. There have been a couple that help do some of the stuff that Keystone was designed to do. Dakota Access Pipeline had an expansion last year. So there are people working to continue to solve those problems.
Right.
And the main goal is to, like you said, get the right kind of crudes to the refineries that can use them.
Right.
So, and just to cap off the point you were making, U.S. refineries have a specific, and you may have mentioned this on your podcast at another point in time, but U.S. refineries have slates of crudes that they like to run. So we produce a lot of lighter or super light crude in the U.S., primarily driven by growth from the shale basins like Permian and Bakken and Anadarko and Eagle Ford. But we produce so much of that light and super light crude that the domestic refineries can't run it all.
Right.
So it's that excess light and super light that generates our growing exports of crude to the international market, which is like 3 million barrels a day. But we still, our refining sector was designed to run heavy and medium grade crudes that we thought we were going to be importing a lot of prior to the shale revolution. So there's still this requirement for us to import a lot of crudes, which is why we're talking about Canadian heavy crude in the first place coming out of the Gulf Coast, because it has a valid slot to fill in those Gulf Coast refineries. Not having Canadian crude doesn't mean that there is less heavy or medium crude being run in those Gulf Coast refineries. It just means we're having to ship it on, giant VLCC 2 million barrel capacity tankers from across the ocean into the Gulf Coast. So
from Venezuela
or Iraq or
Nigeria. Yeah.
A lot of places with, not so palatable regimes.
Right. Mexico also provides a lot of sour crude. Is that right?
They do. Mexico actually came out earlier this year and said they were planning to stop exporting crude to the U.S., presumably to all but the Pemex-owned refinery, which is the Deer Park refinery. So those imports from Mexico could be going away, along with obviously what we're not importing from Russia anymore, which was about 200,000 barrels a day of crude oil.
That Keystone pipeline sure would be nice.
Yeah. Well, considering now we're talking, okay, well, we don't have the heavy barrels we need from our very nice democratically led northern neighbor. So let's go talk to Venezuela.
Let's go to Venezuela, and yeah, I know it makes your head explode.
Right.
I just hope. Look, I want the environment to be saved. We need to improve the environment. We need to mitigate climate change, of course, but we don't need to prop up these types of regimes. And I want to get there big time. So This is a great segue. So in 2014, I'm training in Russia. I love Russia. I love the people. the highlight of my time on the space station was hanging out with my cosmonaut friends. I really had a good time with those guys. They invade Crimea, and the first thing I thought was, well, we're going to start building our own rocket engine, because we were buying Russian RD-180 engines to power our Atlas rockets that were launching our spy satellites and our military satellites to spy on Russia. So Russia gave us the engines, and then we would go spy on them with the engines they were selling us. It's insane. And that's what we did. We started spending $1 billion a year, and we developed a US engine. And now Russia's not going to be selling any more of these engines. It's going to crush their space industry in the long term. I also said we need to build out LNG infrastructure so that Europe stops being so dependent. Russia just has them by the, you know what, in 2014, and nobody did this. And now here it is in 2022. Oh my God, it's a disaster. So with all that being said, talk about LNG, or talk about natural gas, what it's used for electricity and heating, blah, blah, blah. And then why the pipeline to Russia was so important, and can we do anything going back? So just a few minutes about the whole natural gas infrastructure. And I think sometimes it comes from just crude oil production, and sometimes you have dedicated natural gas wells, right? It's both.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, so I'll start with the upstream, and I'll sort of work my way downstream. So US is currently producing about 92 BCF a day. It's down just a little bit recently.
Billion cubic feet.
Billion cubic feet per day. And a slight majority of that is coming from what's called associated natural gas production wells, meaning that the producer in this case is drilling for oil, and as icing on the cake, they get natural gas that comes along from the right. It all comes out of the same hole in the ground. There are lots of different ways it can happen, but generally speaking, the other way we talk about it is on-purpose natural gas, or just dry natural gas. So places like the big natural gas basins you hear talked about a lot are the Haynesville in Louisiana and the Marcellus in Utica, Appalachia. They produce a tremendous amount of natural gas without a whole bunch of crude oil along for the ride, though they can produce a lot of natural gas liquids like ethane, propane, butane, natural gasoline that then get stripped out at natural gas processing plants.
So those are NGLs, not to be confused with LNG.
We're getting deep into this stuff now.
This is an acronym soup here.
Yeah, keep me honest. If I get too wonky, just call me back.
Okay. This podcast is sponsored by Book Arts, the world's premier creators of unique books that are truly works of art. To see an example of one of their beautiful creations, a limited edition reproduction of the Apollo 11 flight plan, visit www.apolloflightplan.com. So
for simplicity's sake, let's just say 90 BCF a day, 90 billion cubic feet a day of US production, 50-50 associated gas and dry natural gas. The thing about having natural gas as an associated product with crude oil is you're making your money from those wells off of the crude oil or the natural gas liquids that you're selling. So you need a far lower price for natural gas to be able to justify your production. That and the natural gas wells in places like Haynesville and Appalachia, where you do have dry natural gas, those wells are so prolific that their per unit value that they need to get for that natural gas is very, very low. So these are all reasons why here in the US, we have some of the cheapest natural gas prices in the world. And it could be even better, right? So that's the upstream part of it. Now, you have to get those natural gas supplies to the market where they're going to be consumed. By far, the most efficient way to do that is natural gas pipelines. We're talking about billions of cubic feet. So you compress that natural gas down, you put it on a pipeline, and you ship it to market. like we said, that a lot of the natural gas has liquids in it. So in any case where you have a lot of liquids, you have to run it through a natural gas processing plant, strip out those natural gas liquids, sell them into their own market, and then take the natural gas on to its end use markets. The processing, the storage, the pipelines, everything prior to the end markets for natural gas, that's what we generally refer to as the midstream sector.
Right.
Yep.
Shipping. And you want, with oil, you can put it on a train, you can put it on an 18-wheeler.
Right.
But with natural gas, you either need to use it at the site or you need to ship it via pipeline.
Generally speaking, yeah. You can liquefy it, and you can even put liquefied natural gas, LNG,
Right.
on trucks. It's just not efficient.
It's expensive. Yeah.
It's expensive, not efficient at any sort of business, but there are companies that they're doing that kind of stuff.
Unless you put it on a ship, right?
Yep. And because those ships are so huge,
Right.
you have these economies of scale that go along with it, and you're able to ship it to premium destination markets like Northwest Europe or Asia.
Right.
And they have made, they have been really driving the global LNG market because after Fukushima, particularly in Japan, there was a big move away from nuclear into natural gas. And for the longest time, natural gas has been viewed as, it's cliche to say, a bridge fuel, right? It's a very clean burning, relatively clean burning fossil fuel that's extremely efficient in what they call combined cycle natural gas plants, which is basically just using natural gas to generate electricity. And so it's places who have done massive transitions in their power generation fleet from, say, coal or fuel oil to natural gas. That's been the biggest carbon emission savings, across the world, right? That's giant.
But can I just interject?
Yeah.
Fukushima happens, and Germany has a vote, and they vote to do away with their German-made, Western European, no-emission nuclear power plants, so that they can buy electricity from Czechoslovakia that has the Chernobyl Model 1A nuclear power plant, and also from carbon-emitting natural gas plants. I just want to say that Germany, where there are no tsunamis or earthquakes,
and who is planning to shut down their last 3 nuclear plants this year as they continue to write checks to Russia,
and are the cause of World War III in this Nord Stream pipeline, Ukraine invasion. Yeah, it's so important to understand that so often energy decisions are made on emotion and ideology and not on facts. And that what's happened in Western Europe is the most egregious example. And it's costing us. It costs the whole world when people make decisions based on emotion. Anyway, I just had to interject that.
Well, you bring up the really valid point of the importance of midstream. So you generally want to have a pipeline to get your natural gas to market. As the public perception towards fossil fuels has declined, the chances of getting a new gas pipeline built have been diminished substantially. So the poster child example right now is a pipeline up in the Northeast called Mountain Valley Pipeline. It would provide, roughly 2 billion cubic feet of additional natural gas along the Atlantic seaboard. That gas would help displace gas all the way down into the Gulf Coast, again, making supplies cheaper.
And more efficient. From a carbon emissions point of view, more efficient.
Yep. But that pipeline, despite being something like 94% completely built, we don't know if it will ever actually get finished.
What is it called?
Mountain Valley Pipeline. It has faced so many court challenges that the sponsors of the project have already started backing off and writing off the project costs because they don't know if it'll actually get done.
Yeah.
Talk about short-term decisions. And again, I'm picking on Appalachia here because they're right next to one of the biggest, cheapest natural gas producing fields in the world in Marcellus, Utica. And yet, when it gets cold in New England, they burn fuel oil. They burn biomass because they don't have the pipeline infrastructure to be able to get enough natural gas in there in the winter to be able to supply people in the northern states. It's absolutely wild.
They also, I understand there's a crude oil pipeline issue too that the state of New York wouldn't do, and so they were importing crude from Russia because they wouldn't build a crude oil pipeline. One of my partners at my company told me that. I don't know the details of it.
Yeah, you look at, so in PAD 2, the Petroleum Area Defense District 2, which is basically the center of the United States, Great Plains area, their refineries have tremendous feedstock advantages because they have pipeline access to Bakken crude, to Canadian crude. So they're able to operate at a big advantage, whereas when you get into the East Coast, you don't have all the same feedstock options that you do in the middle of the country or on the Gulf Coast. And you've seen a lot of refineries in that region shut down as a result.
Because they don't have reasonably priced access to their feedstock, their crude oil.
They can't compete.
Yeah. So back to my thesis in 2014, could we have built out the infrastructure? So we make all this natural gas in Pennsylvania and Ohio, New York, wherever it is, they're right there on the East Coast. Utica, right?
Yeah.
In Marcellus.
New York.
Marcellus, yeah. So put that in a pipeline to New York City or Boston, wherever the port is, Baltimore, compress it, liquefy it, put it on a boat and ship it to Europe. And then the Europeans have American natural gas reasonably efficiently, and they're not depending on Vladimir Putin for their heating and electricity.
It'd be nice.
Can we do that? I mean, why didn't we do it? Can we still do it? Is building out that infrastructure? We can't do it overnight. Unfortunately, these things take years, right?
Right. So to compress and supercool the natural gas, you have to have a liquefaction facility. Right. Those guys cost a couple $2 billion a pop. So they're very, very expensive. Almost all of the capacity right now is on the Gulf Coast in Texas, Louisiana. Whether or not something good, and there are LNG import facilities on the East Coast, and there's talk about putting LNG export facilities on the East Coast up in Canada. But again, getting those projects cleared, if you were asking me to be in charge of a project to put an LNG export terminal on the East Coast of the United States, I'd say have a nice life. I don't know.
You'd rather go solve peace in the Palestinians and Israelis or something like that.
Yeah. So everything we send out is, or not everything, the vast majority of what we send out is all Texas and Louisiana. And to be honest, they are running and gunning right now. You got to imagine natural gas prices in Europe are 6 to 7 times more expensive than they are here in the US. So anybody who can divert their natural gas to Europe, they're doing it. So all those LNG facilities, they are operating above capacity. They're creating additional shipments every month to be able to try and feed as much as they can. And it's an economic decision as much as a humanitarian one.
Right, of course. But we're taking gas that we would have been sending to Asia and sending it to Europe, right? So then the Asians are buying it from Russia.
Yeah. And well, and the price, the Asian price marker that we usually talk about is called the Japan Korea marker. And just recently, that price has gone way, way, way up, obviously, to compete for internationally sourced liquefied natural gas. And there were some earthquakes over there, so they suddenly have the same need for natural gas to fuel their generation. Uh, I think at this point maybe we segue into the reap what you sow conversation about renewables.
Mhm. That's an important one. So anyway, we could provide Europe with natural gas, but you're not hopeful just because of the political headwinds of building these projects.
Well, I mean, we're providing a tremendous amount of natural gas to Europe. Could we fully offset the imports that they're receiving from Russia? Not in any sort of meaningful time frame where it would be the basis of a long-term investment decision, I feel like.
Yeah.
But I think we're sending out somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 or 7 BCF a day to Europe right now.
Right.
Billion cubic feet a day, which
Right.
is far in excess of what the White House suggested we send. This weekend, they said we're going to send an additional 15 BCM, billion cubic meters of natural gas to Europe. Well, that's like me looking outside and telling you I'm going to make the sun shine. It's happening, right?
It is happening. Right. I read your blog today. It made that point loud and clear. We're already sending a lot over there.
Yeah.
But to send more and to meaningfully in the long term kind of compete against Russia's natural gas supply would take billions of dollars of investment over multiple years.
And it's one step harder than that even, because they have to have, once you liquefy the natural gas, you put it on a ship, you send it over to Europe.
Right.
They have to have the regasification, the facilities
Right.
to be able to turn that liquid back into a gas to put it into their own pipelines. And then once you're in those pipelines, again, you have to have the pipeline capacity to shuttle it around Europe.
Right.
There is not enough of that at the capacity needed to be able to displace Russian gas. So all of those things would have to fall into place, which kind of highlights this larger point that we have huge developed infrastructure networks to be able to deliver energy in this traditional way. Any deviation from it is going to be a massive economic impact.
Yeah. Okay. So to the energy transition, and there's a lot there. We could do 5 podcasts about this. There's wind, there's solar, there's nuclear, which is not nearly addressed properly. Biogas, geothermal. The thesis I have, and I just can't overemphasize the importance of this, and it's not nearly discussed enough. Maybe with Ukraine, we'll start talking about it more. But if you go back to the 20th century, it was probably the largest wealth transfer in history from developed nations to OPEC. Saudi, Iraq, Iran, UAE, Kuwait, Venezuela, and Russia, OPEC plus. How'd that work out for us? We've been paying guys combat pay for over 30 years now. When I joined the Air Force, I was in pilot training when Saddam invaded Iraq as a second lieutenant. And 32 years later, guys are still in Iraq, still getting paid combat pay. So it just wasn't a great idea to provide that much wealth to somebody that didn't have our best interests in mind. And now when it comes to wind and especially solar, and most especially batteries, we're doing the same thing with China. We're on the precipice of sending the Chinese Communist Party trillions of dollars for this. And now Germany's like, well, now Russia doesn't want to provide us with gas and we're going to freeze to death this winter. But what if China doesn't want to provide us with the minerals we need to make batteries? Or if they invade Taiwan, what if we don't have any microchips? Because most microchips are made in Taiwan. We know what a lack of chips does. We've all seen that for the last 2 years. So there's my thesis that we need to be careful what we wish for when it comes to energy transition. And I'm not even saying we shouldn't electrify. I'm saying we should electrify and buy those materials from America, from China, from Mexico, or not China, from Canada or Mexico, Japan, Europe, whatever, countries that aren't going to be fundamentally opposed in our most basic values. That's my thesis.
I totally agree. The materials intensity of an energy transition, I think, is way beyond what most people imagine. Like we see with energy transition, there's this very nearsighted view of, and it's almost maybe a consequence of us growing up watching superhero movies or something like that, where we think, you can flip on a switch and, these things just appear. And it looks like a big tower, but there's, like you said, tons of copper and lithium and all of these sorts of materials that go into wind generation and photovoltaic cells. And we're getting a little bit outside my area of expertise, but the idea that we are going to outsource the development of those materials to, like you said, countries like China and Russia, and they're going to open up, massive mines to be able to source all these rare earths and supply us. And I don't know what the ecological impact of that is, but I can't imagine it's small, or the economic impact. And mortgaging, security, energy security for something like that, that's a tough pill to swallow.
It's extremely tough. And the New York Times they have a podcast called The Daily. It's really good. Mm-hmm. And last week they did one on rare earth mines. It was cobalt mining in the DRC, I think. It's a bonanza. People are you just dig it out of the dirt and you have cobalt, which is one of the things you need for batteries, I guess. But China went through a national program over the last 20 years called the Belt and Road Initiative, where they went out and basically, the term I want to use is not correct, but they lent a lot of money to third world countries, and now they're beholden to them in debt, and they have access to the materials and infrastructure. So they undertook a national strategy, realizing that batteries and solar was going to be a big deal one day, and now it is. And now if you want to buy a solar panel, it's probably made, at least in part, in China. If you want to make a battery, it's made in China. If you buy a Tesla to save the planet, you're buying something that was made in China using minerals that are slave labor, in Africa or whatever. It's a really not pretty picture that we just kind of ignore, I think.
Well, and think of how much more there has to be from an energy perspective. Renewables are just scratching the surface of what they're going to have to do to replace hydrocarbons. There's going to have to be such a tremendous, all the things we talked about with energy midstream, that all has to be rebuilt to maintain the supply chains that are going to have to happen for renewables to proliferate.
Talk about, and also the importance of batteries. So wind and solar are great, and I never really realized this until recently. I didn't even know this was a thing, but the battery is required for that.
Oh, for wind and solar? Yeah. They go hand in hand, because obviously it's again cliche to say that the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow. So you have these periods, primarily at night, where any electricity you are relying on from wind and solar doesn't show up unless you have previously stored it. And primarily what we're talking about these days is battery development. And there are some huge battery installations in places like California, where there's been a lot of push to move to those sorts of energy models. And they've got challenges. The big facilities have tripped offline recently. And so it's had a lot of people kind of scratching their heads. And
oh, really?
Yeah.
The batteries tripped offline?
Yeah, huge batteries, bit to support, and
wow,
the name is not coming to me off the top of my head. But I think it shorted out. It was a water issue, and the batteries shorted out.
Yeah.
So they had to shut down, restart the facility. There's got to be a lot of that. We've talked in the past one thing astronauts and energy folks have in common is hydrogen, right?
Yeah.
Hydrogen as a method of storing energy, honestly, I'm a huge fan of, but it's again, you get back to the economic argument of how do you make those sort of green hydrogen energy models work, and it gets real tough real fast because you're competing against more traditional hydrocarbon based energy sources, which are frankly just a lot cheaper right now.
Yeah. No, economically, it's not good. I mean, look, in the long run, you want to minimize, and it's not only carbon emissions, it's methane, sulfur. There's lots of bad gases. Putting trillions of tons of pollution in the air is not a good idea, but neither is propping up the Chinese Communist Party. So, or having to spend huge amounts of money for energy, which creates human misery too. Like you know, you have to balance these things.
And unfortunately, I think a lot of it gets lost in the conversation, right? You talk to people with political agendas, either right or left, and they have both sides have problems. But there's a responsible way to use cleaner sources of fuel like natural gas to transition our way into renewable type fuels. It's just going to take a lot longer than most people tend to anticipate.
Full disclosure, I'm working part-time in the carbon capture sector, but the idea of having natural gas electricity with carbon capture seems pretty appealing. That seems a lot more appealing than Chinese-made batteries, because we basically have limitless natural gas. The shale revolution's given us centuries worth of natural gas. And we know how to do carbon capture. We just need to work on making it less expensive. That, to me, that seems like a pretty good alternative. Or if nothing else, use your solar during the day and use your cheap natural gas with carbon capture at night. That's a pretty good bridge in my mind, anyway.
Yeah, like you said, there are challenges there to, generation facilities don't start and stop on a dime. So we have natural gas peaking units that tend to ramp up anytime we have heavy loads on the power sector, but it's not without startup costs. So I don't know the answer to how much additional savings you have if you're having to ramp those things on and off. And regarding the carbon capture, again, the energy sector ought to love this, right? I mean, you're drilling holes in the ground to capture carbon. They've been doing the exact opposite of that for years. So nobody's better trained to do this kind of stuff than the folks who have been doing it.
Yeah. Or using old wells. So you don't necessarily have to drill new wells. If you're in a place where there are old wells, sometimes you can use the well. It depends on the geology.
Yeah. So just to go down that path for a little bit. So
go down that hole.
Yeah, go down that hole. So what we're talking about is the difference between carbon capture and sequestration, CCS, versus carbon capture use and sequestration, or CCUS. So in carbon capture and sequestration, what we're talking about is capturing carbon primarily from anthropogenic sources. And the types of anthropogenic sources you choose is very heavily dependent on how concentrated the CO2 stream is. So for example, ethanol has a highly concentrated stream of CO2 that can be captured relatively economically. And so you see big carbon capture projects and sequestration projects cropping up in the Midwest, where people want to aggregate all those ethanol production CO2 emissions and stick them in a hole in the ground. Those holes for CCS have to be what's called Class 6 wells. And right now, I'm only aware of one of them that is currently in operation, though there, like you said, there are lots of projects on the drawing board to create more. The alternative is carbon capture use and sequestration. And that's where you're taking the captured carbon and shoving it into existing reservoirs. But what it's used for is enhanced oil recovery. So it's going to generate additional crude oil when you pump that CO2 into the ground. The good news is it is currently the biggest sink for CO2, the biggest man-made sink. Obviously, the carbon cycle is huge and there are much more large natural sinks, but it's the biggest man-made sink for CO2 in the US. The bad news is if you're fighting against fossil fuels, it creates more crude oil. And I think net, you're better off from a carbon perspective, but that's still a tough one to sell.
EOR, yeah. The good thing about EOR is it's the most efficient way. And I think, if you're going to drill a well, you ought to get every drop of oil out of it. Then you drill less wells, and also you save some for future generations. 300, 400 years from now, people are probably not going to be happy with us that we used up most of the crude oil. But there's a really interesting technology where you take carbon and you can make rocks like calcium carbonates, which is basically cement aggregate, concrete aggregate. And so you can actually make useful rocks out of carbon, which is carbon dioxide, which is pretty amazing. If that technology works, that would be a way to make revenue out of carbon dioxide emissions, not just have it be an expense. Right now, it's just an expense that government subsidies pay for, but that there's potential for actually making something useful out of it. We'll see if that. Yeah,
there's a pretty decent CO2 market, and we got into this a little bit, right? So everybody talks about CO2 as if there you go, my man.
You need it in Coca-Cola.
That and it's huge in meat processing, right? So when you've got to knock out a pig because it's time to make bacon, a lot of times they're going to be using CO2 as the agent to do that, and it's a considerable market for CO2.
I did not know that. Plus rock concerts, they got to have the CO2 ice, the smoke going across the crowd.
now you're thinking rock and roll, man. I like
exactly. Well, the energy transition is interesting. What stands out to you as technologies that make sense or are interesting, or ones that are oversold? As when you just look at the overall energy transition market, what do you think?
So again, it's all about having a mix of energy technologies, suppliers. We need to have flexibility. It's like that with anything, right? So it's not just natural gas. I think natural gas is a big part of a transition to a cleaner energy future. But it's not just natural gas. You're not going to be able to shut down coal overnight. I don't know anything about nuclear, but I got to feel like it is part of an energy mix. In fact, I'd love to hear your thoughts on nuclear, but I got to think it's part of an energy mix. Solar and wind, they're going to be growing. They've got to grow, right? I personally, from a purely just a fanboy perspective, I love the idea of a green hydrogen value chain. Mm-hmm. I think it's going to take a long time for those sorts of things to make economic sense, but really it's an all of the above type scenario right now. And it's one of those things where we just progress one step at a time. We start weeding out the most carbon intensive sources one at a time and going forward from there. But it's not going to happen in 10 years. Otherwise, it's not going to happen in 10 years. And if we try to, we're just going to push the problem, like we've seen, into countries that will actually supply the oil and gas that we like to print it in that we don't need, but we really do.
Yeah, exactly. We need to get ideology out of our energy, because I teach a class about Columbia and Challenger, the shuttle accidents, and Richard Feynman had a really great quote after the Challenger accident that went along the lines of nature doesn't care about politics or whatever, it just cares about the physics. Yeah. In other words, if you have ideology behind something, it's not going to help you out. So that's the kind of thing that we need to, all of the above, I think, is the right idea. But when you hear a Democrat say all of the above, they mean all of the above except nuclear, except natural gas and with carbon capture or whatever. And when you hear a Republican say all of the above, they mean all of the above except wind and solar or whatever. So right. we need to understand, and also we need to look at things in terms of, is this really going to give us a benefit? Like, what is the no kidding dollar cost for for the kilowatt hour? And is it really going to reduce emissions? And most importantly, David, we talked about what's the security implication? Are we funding adversaries of democracy and freedom? And if the answer is yes, then the last century of American foreign policy has been a history of us kind of closing our eyes, holding our nose, and making a deal with some dictator somewhere, and it never works out well with us. So it's not going to continue. It's not going to work out well with us as we move into this energy transition.
So look, there is a little bit of a bright side. Is to all the stuff that's happening in Europe right now, you got to think that it's been a little bit of a wake-up call for particularly the Europeans, but even for people here in the US, your dad, who sit here and notice what's happening all of a sudden with global commodity prices and realizing, oh my gosh, we still need this stuff in a major way. We like to think that maybe even some of the opposition on Capitol Hill has started to notice as well. Whether or not they can actually say anything about it is an open question, but I think what's happening right now has opened a lot of people's eyes to say, hey, we need to slow our roll about this. Just, make sure we're doing things prudently instead of based on ideology.
Yeah, I like that thing. So here's the thing. I was out car shopping a few months ago, and I found a plug-in hybrid, and I was like, man, this is pretty cool because it's got a gas motor. If you need to drive to San Antonio, you can, but it's got a small battery. And so if all you're doing is driving around town, you never have to buy gas. Literally, if all you do is take the kids to school and go to the grocery store, you would never buy gas. And it's that kind of intermediate situation. And you're also not buying $10,000 worth of batteries from China. You're buying $1,000 worth of batteries, right? So it's an intermediate. It helps a lot. It's not perfect, but those are the kind of, I'm a moderate guy. I in general in life, but I think the plug-in hybrid is the euphemism or metaphor for the kinds of things that we need in the energy industry in the big picture.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And the fact that you're willing to make a personal change, it's got to be a lot of people making a lot of those type of decisions.
Right. Well, hey, man, thank you so much for the time. I could talk about energy forever. I love space, and space is cool, but energy is what makes life on Earth what it is. And so that's really, that needs to be the 21st century moonshot, I think. And RBN Energy is the best. I tell you what, whoever's listening, if you guys like energy, interested in this subject, go to was it rbn.com?
rbnenergy.com. Yep.
Romeo Bravo November.
Yep.
It may stand for Rusty Braziel Energy.
Rusty Braziel's network.
Oh, Rusty Braziel Network. Okay, there you go.
Yeah.
Well, all right. Well, thanks again, David. I appreciate it. And again, if you like the podcast, subscribe. And if you like energy, subscribe to rbnenergy.com.